Hello, welcome to another Women's from History Talks. And we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Helen Pankhurst. And I will let you introduce yourself shortly, Helen, but we're delighted to find out more. And we're going to just have a conversation really about Sylvia, who I was fascinated with since watching the Sylvia play as well. So over to you, and we'll just have a conversation about the Pankhurst family as well. I'm sure we'll creep in.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Kate. Nice to be with you and to be supporting your campaign. I'm Sylvia's granddaughter, so Sylvia being the middle daughter of Emmeline, and she went on to be involved in all sorts of issues. And yeah, we will go into that in a minute, I think. But I am Sylvia's granddaughter.
And what in terms of Sylvia, she isn't one of the Pankhursts that a lot of people obviously most know about Emmeline. But what do you think? Why is she almost a forgotten Pankhurst, would you say, in some areas or
I think some people know a lot about her and will say things to me like, well, she's my favorite banker.
yeah.
She was very far on the left of the political divide. Most people know Emmeline, the mother, and then I would say Sylvia's probably better known than Christabel in many circles.
Mm,
Christabel and
mm,
Emmeline ended up being on the right of the political spectrum and had very different views to Sylvia. So there's a very clear schism between those three. And then least known, I think, would be Adela, the youngest of
yeah.
the girls who went off and lived in Australia, and there's a whole story around that. But the schisms within the Pankhurst family are very much part of the storyline. I often ask people when I'm doing talks and things like that, which first name do you know? And usually it's Emmeline that comes up
Mm,
first,
mm.
and then Sylvia, and then Christabel. And I still find it phenomenal that over 100 years ago, people know the first names of three women in one family who were involved in making history. Not enough of such women that are known by the next generation or the generation after that.
Yeah, and a bit like us with the Ada campaign as well. It's so important that people remember, what they stood for and what they have done for generations coming through as well. Do what do you think? I assume Ada and Sylvia in today's world probably would be very aligned in terms of what they were campaigning for. Ada was very much for, all women to have the votes and, better working rights and equal pay. Do you think that that was part of a line with what Sylvia was as well, more than perhaps a mum?
Yeah, yes, definitely. I mean, Sylvia disagreed with her sister and mother on all sorts of things, and I think it compounds over time. So it starts off with feeling the sense that you couldn't just campaign on women's rights without being on the same platform with other social issues. And in particular, this is the time of Irish nationalism. And then she feels that it's important to take on board issues around understanding class, not just gender, and the intersections between class and gender in terms of women's experiences of poverty. Um, and then also the issue of voice. So who's representing this party? Who's representing the change? Who's encouraged to lead? And Sylvia very much felt that this had to be the voice of working class women because of their double, triple discrimination. And that also meant their decision, their voice, their ideas, and not just a military campaign, which is what Emmeline and Christabel felt this was about. And in a military campaign, they felt you obey the leader
Mm,
because that's how decisions should be made. So you can see an arg I mean, I can understand the arguments both ways. But
mm.
definitely Sylvia and Ada were more on the left side of the politics and understanding that link between class and gender.
Yeah, and it still fascinates me how they could create such a movement where any movement today is related to like social media or petitions and the hard work that must have gone on to communicate, what their values were and what their beliefs were, because it's not as simple as writing a post anymore, then, is it?
They were superb at the whole PR and
Mm,
comms and strategic thinking about how to
mm,
make their arguments heard. I mean, phenomenal. I think anybody who was interested in communications could learn a thing or two from how they did all of that. And remember, this is a time when you don't have all of those mechanisms for communication, and yet, they did chalking on the pavements. They used color. You don't even need words. You just have three colors and everybody knows
mm,
what you're talking about. They used very few words, deeds, not words.
mm.
Votes for women, the hashtag of their day. They were incredibly clever at doing that, and a lot of lateral thinking. I mean, I show people the one penny that had votes for women embossed on the king's head. So you disrupt and you do things which are very much disruptive, and that you can be accused of um, in so many ways, but still effective at communicating, at sharing your message. Um, yeah, really phenomenal in that way.
Do we know what was Sylvia's kind of driving force to be more on the left? Was it her life experience or colleagues, friends?
Well, they came from that background in that they were Richard Pankhurst and Emmeline were founding members of the Independent Labour Party and had been, and Richard Pankhurst, her father, was a barrister who took up a lot of causes on, and was known as the radical barrister who was interested in understanding and addressing social um, concerns and poverty and discrimination of that kind. So I think that's where it comes from. But also, she was, by all accounts, a rather sensitive person. She was an artist, and artist
Mm,
or campaigner who used her eyes to look at what was going on. And I think that combination of being really quite an introspective character who felt that things very deeply and saw things and documented, and not just through her art, but also through words. And then, down the line, also through becoming an editor of a journal, through poetry, etc. I think felt those in what we now call intersectionality. She
mm.
felt those different marginalizations that women experienced and wanted to do something about them. And not just as a suffragette. I think that for me, one of the most fascinating things about suffragette, about Sylvia, all the causes that she took up. So she wasn't just a one cause person. It was one
Mm,
thing after another, and she was ahead of her time in so many of them, not just as a suffragette, but also looking at those issues of intersection around class we've just talked about. She was a pacifist in the First World War. She was an active campaigner against the Second World War at times when many people were just blind to the rise of fascism. She was calling it out. She was a Pan-Africanist. I mean, just astounding number of causes that she took up.
and I was reading a bit about her today actually, and she was the one that first mentioned around childcare, wasn't she, as well? And I think what really depresses me a lot is, Sylvia and Ada were still fighting that fight now with a lot of what they were talking about, but they started some of their movements, didn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we feel that right now more than ever, that yes, there are waves that we talk about in feminism when there's progress, and they are both part of that first wave of feminism. And there have been many others, well, four others, probably three or four, depending how you count these things. But what we don't measure or talk about so much is when that wave goes backwards. And we
Mm,
are no doubt experiencing that at the moment in so many ways. So they would recognize, I think, so much of the problems that we're facing now. I think, in particular, around violence against women, actually,
mm,
that's the one factor that pulls us back. But they would, both of them would probably be particularly interested in the rise of inequality, economic inequality, and
yeah.
how problematic that is, the precarity of work for so many women and men now.
And the gender pay gap as well. I think that was part of, well,
Mm,
massive agenda for Ada.
mm.
But that's something that's, like you say, raising its head so much more now as well. Do you think do you think if it was any time Emmeline would have kind of aligned with some of Sylvia's thoughts as time went on, or do you think it was just the votes for Emmeline?
I think there were so many reasons for that schism. Between Emily and Christabel on one hand and Sylvia on the other, I don't see how it could have been reconciled. I think there's
Mm,
all, it's deep rooted and it's painful, and the fact that you mentioned healthcare and maternity
mm,
issues. The fact that Sylvia had my father out of wedlock, because had she married her partner, she would have lost the right to vote. He was an Italian
mm,
at the time. You would have become he was a alien, and women didn't keep the right to vote. So of course she wasn't going to marry him. That and
mm,
a number of other reasons actually. So for Emily, that was problematic. But the fact that her daughter was doing her own thing and not following her leadership, her role as the mother to kind of to manage all of this was, I think, personal on so many fronts. I have been reflecting a bit about why Emmeline became more and more of a conservative, and I wondered, in the context also of looking at the parallels between the politics today, how on the left, we have had so many women involved in parliament. So it's 40% of the Labour Party have women MPs, but there's never been a woman leading from the
leader.
Labour
Mm.
Party. But the Conservative Party, the numbers are very few, but we've had four leaders of the Conservative Party that are women. And I wonder whether there's something intrinsic in the idea of leadership that leads you to think of hierarchy, that leads you to think that you can make decisions in that way. And therefore, maybe that's why Emmeline and Christabel, as this kind of forceful leaders of the movement, the military movements, ended up being quite conservative. That isn't to say that I feel that leadership should be necessarily of that kind, but you can, in a way, understand why Sylvia believed in democracy and voice and remained left wing, because that resonates with those ideas, and why Christabel and Emmeline moved in a different direction.
Would you see Sylvia as a clear leader? I think when we think of Emmeline, we think of a leader, but Sylvia perhaps in a different way, her leadership style.
Very different way, and I think maybe would resonate more with the ideas of how you lead today in terms of consensual procedures and not putting your own voice forward. Making collaboration, devolved decision making. In so many ways, she represented that. She was all about. In fact, for me, the summary of her is the word others, that she always put others forward and facilitated their voice, their visibility. And an example of that is the deputation to Asquith of working class women. She, put her life on the line by being on hunger strike even after taken out of prison, uh, demanding that Asquith saw this deputation. He eventually agreed to it. She was, in essence, really compromising her life, and he agreed to that. And then they went on that meeting. There was no question of her going, her speaking for them, or anything like that. It was their voice that was required. And it takes, some kind of leader to do that,
Mm.
facilitate that rather than um, take command. And I'm not, I'm clearly very, very biased, but I'm sure there are ways in which she, didn't represent the best in so many ways. But I still think there's an incredible amount that one can admire about her.
Mm. She's extremely, I think, like say, forward thinking and modern in her approach. She could had a clear view of what needs to be changed for so many people, didn't she?
The other thing about her was that she combined practical with strategic. So,
Mm,
that she understood that in order to campaign for strategic change, the right to vote, you couldn't do that unless you looked at the practical reasons why working class women couldn't campaign. So, hence the setting up of, or transforming the Gunners Arms, which was a pub, into the Mother's Arms, which was a creche, the low cost restaurant where food could be produced in bulk, and people could eat in a restaurant in that way, and a number of other strategic approaches to address the real concerns, the immediate concerns of women, as well as their longer term ones.
and somebody's asked a question on the group chat. Can I ask about Kia Hardy? Yeah, Kia Hardy.
Yeah, so th there was a long-term relationship between the Pankhurst family and Keir Hardie. As mentioned, they were founder members of the ILP, the Independent Labour Party, which he ran, they being Emmeline and Richard. Sylvia that initially saw him very much as a father figure, but then when she moved to London, he was very supportive, and they ended up having an affair. It's well documented. I think initially
Mm,
some skepticism about to what extent it was an affair, where the boundaries were. But the more I've looked into it, the more obvious it is to me that they did. There's some amazing. So when she was one of the times when she was in prison, she wrote on toilet paper that was available to her in prison, and using a pencil which she had smuggled in because she wasn't allowed any paper or any way to write. She wrote this play, which is just incredible to think about being in prison and using toilet paper to write not a poem. She probably did. In fact, she did do a bit of that, but to write a whole play.
mm,
It's just incredible. And that play is about her relationship with, well, clearly two characters, one of which is her and the other is Keir, and the other is the relationship between gender and class more widely. And she interplays with these two, the personal and the wider political context. A fascinating play, which Rachel Holmes has transcribed with a lot of difficulty. And so, that's available as a book. It's been published as a book. But he was really instrumental in, I think, her political development, and probably likewise the other way round.
mm,
Um, she wasn't someone who just saw age as a reason why you don't treat somebody as an equal. And the other person she does this to is George Bernard Shaw, by the way, who she chastises no end, despite the fact that he was so much older than her and, really well known at leading figure in the cultural spaces, and yet she criticized him because he was very, very slow to realize the dangers of fascism, um, and put his name, his power behind making awareness of that, despite the fact that he was had very left wing
mm.
thoughts. Can I just pause for
Yeah, yeah, I
one?
was going to say that. Yeah,
Thank you.
a lot of the work that the Pankhurst did. What influence would you say Sylvia's had on your family? And the generations going down, or all of the Pankhursts, I guess.
Um, so Sylvia's influence, I suppose, for my father, her son, was the latter work. So the work around Ethiopian independence. He became a historian focusing on Ethiopian history, and also towards the end of his life in some of the work around restitution. So to try and get some of the items looted by the British and the Italians, because the British were involved in looting as well in Ethiopia. Um, so he got involved in that kind of thing, which I'm sure which follows on from some of the campaigning that she was doing to make sure that Ethiopia would be considered as an independent country. And she campaigned not just against Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, but at a certain point when there was the British were involved because they were involved in the and bringing the emperor back into power, it looked like they were going to retain control of some aspects. So she then found herself campaigning, to make sure that Britain didn't do that. So that was his work. Mine has been picking up a lot on women's rights globally and locally, in that I've worked in international development most of my life, but also become very interested in the issue of the barriers to women in politics, and set up
Mm,
something called Centenary Action, or convene something called Centenary Action, which people can Google, but it's very much about bringing people together to look at what the barriers are and how we can push for an equal parliament by the next election. We're at 40% at the moment, and it's looking at what the structural barriers are, but also encouraging people to vote and looking at how different people can engage with that, if they're in the private sector or if they're in civil society. I think there are ways in which we can all come together to create an ecosystem that supports that change. And I think in a lot of my approaches, you will hear influences around how Sylvia's done things. And then the other things is I felt in a way a kind of honorary Mancunian. So I've done a lot in Manchester, and I've been involved in something called GM for Women, which is
Mm.
data for what's going on with women and girls in Greater Manchester around a 10-year period as well, between 2018 centenary when some women got the vote and 2028 centenary of equal franchise. And we've been trying to encourage the use of data, which, by the way, Sylvia was really, really keen on using to campaign. So the use of data to look at what's going on and to create platforms for affecting, to look at how one can affect change.
Yeah, I've been to quite a few of your conferences with that, and it is fascinating. And going back to what you just said about the voting as well, that's something that worries me, that a lot of the younger generation just don't see the point in voting, and that's something I want to do, is go back into schools and just remind them, of the work that Ada and Emmeline and her children did to get us to have the vote, because I think a lot of young women don't know that that fight took place, really.
Yeah, I think each generation forgets, the next generation doesn't know, and you can't assume. I mean, it'd be stupid to assume that just
Mm,
because we know the next generation does, we have to keep doing it. I'm always surprised by how few people have seen the film Suffragette. I
mm,
assume everybody does, because at a certain point, many people did, but that's
mm,
now, many years ago.
mm,
And so we need to, and that's a very good way of summarizing the issue and sharing it with
mm,
the new generation. But talks in schools, absolutely. That's
mm.
the best way, I think, also the direct link to do that.
And it's aspirations as well, isn't it? I mean, Georgie's on this call, and Georgie and I went to a primary school recently to do like a drama workshop in Ada, and the teachers didn't know about her, and just think, yeah, but this is somebody who all crew girls, could look up to as an inspiration. And I think, it's such a shame. This is kind of the series of these talks as well, to not let these women be forgotten and to bring them to the forefront and people find out more.
One of the initiatives that I'm involved in through Centenary Action, which is the Secretariat for the Women in Parliament APPG, is to try and make sure that in every constituency there is a list of 10 women who have been politically involved in that constituency, so that all MPs, when they're doing school talks and things like that, can reference women in their constituency who've been politically involved, past and present.
Mm,
And also maybe there can be things like walks to visit the places associated with those women's, and maps and so on. So it's an initiative that's just starting. And part of that, the mission is very much to ensure that we have more women that are remembered. And that can
yeah.
be statues. I mean, statues are wonderful because they
Mm,
can affect, they're so visible, aren't they?
mm,
They mark the place in such a clear way.
mm.
But I think also so many other ways to ensure that there are wiki pages for all of these women, to ensure that the next generations of students can find out and
Mm,
write
mm,
poems about them, or plays about them, musicals about them.
mm.
Just keep on reminding people of not just the sacrifices, but the amazing, amazing work of women in the past that we can learn so much about, because so much of it is still so relevant.
Yeah, and I watched Animal Farm, the musical, last week actually, and I know Claire did as well. But that was written, I think it was 1937, and that's today as well. So we have to keep going back to learn, because we go in a wave of cycles, unfortunately, a lot of the time, don't we? But you just mentioned statues, and that is a great link to the statues. So Sylvia hasn't currently got a statue. After watching the Silver musical, that's one thing I come back and researched. But there's a lot of people that want a statue of Sylvia, isn't there?
Yeah, there's been an initiative in the works for over 20 years. There is the maquette, there is the fundraising has been done. It was supposed to be in Clerkenwell Green in London. A place has been decided for it. There's four campaigners who've been pushing for this for a long time, but they haven't yet managed to get it over the line. So let's hope they do before too long. I think it's long overdue.
And you were obviously we're working with Hazel Reeves. Sue is on here, so Sue worked with Hazel Reeves to you get the Elizabeth statue in Congleton as well. And we had a workshop about 8 weeks ago now with Hazel to design Ada, um, and that was far more complicated than what I thought because, like you say, it's about telling the story of someone through a statue, isn't it? And I think the Emmeline one just does that so well,
Yeah.
doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah, it does. I think that having her on the chair with her arms
Hmm.
stretched out and then having that circle, um, which brings people in, it's worked really well, I think. Yeah.
And do you think that that has helped to get the Emmeline story out? Because what one thing we're saying with Ada is the statue is a byproduct of everything else that we want to do around it. To keep telling the story about Ada. And have you found any kind of that's happened in Manchester for Emmeline?
Yes, and the one thing to maybe think about is that we had hoped that the Emmeline statue would be used in marches and when there are events that people could put their flowers there or that it would become a place that represented those issues that people could go to either in
Mm,
small groups or in larger groups, and that very much has happened. So I
mm,
think the placement of where the statue is
mm,
um, needn't be directly where there's a geographic logic to it specifically within the town. So there was no reason why it is for Emmeline where it is within
mm,
Manchester. But the placing of it so that it can be a powerful start or end point to marches or even just a really good location like that might be worth thinking about for a
mm. Yeah, because we were on about children being able to hold Ada's hand as if she's bringing the next generation
brilliant.
up, and schools can go and have pictures and taken with her as well. Well, thank you so much. I don't want to take up much more of your time, but I think it's fascinating, and Sylvia is really fascinating. And in my mind, I convinced myself that Sylvia and Ada would be very good friends and working on the agenda. I just wanted to quickly open up and see if anyone's got any comments or questions that you want to ask at all. Put it in the chat or take yourself off. Sue, did you want to ask one?
No,
Sue?
I asked the one about Keir Hardy.
Ah, right, yeah. Anything else? Go on, Diane.
Yeah, I mean it's thoughts really, and I think we touched on it earlier that sometimes you think we're getting quite a way ahead and aren't we making progress? And then other times, I mean, it was really depressing just on the way back as I was coming back to come online here, hearing on the news about online and physical abuse of young women from angry young men and
Mm,
boys, and you think actually you work so hard to gain respect, say in the workplace or wherever, or just get your voice heard, and then perhaps the more you do that, I think the less women seem to be respected. Now, whether this happened in the past, which it probably did, and we're just hearing about it more, I don't know. But I just think, I just think sometimes you think you're going up there and then it comes back down again, and it's really difficult to see how far we are actually progressing. Perhaps on the one hand, we might be getting a bit more to equal pay, maybe not. But then on the other hand, perhaps more socially, you've got all the Andrew Tates and all this
mm,
sort of thing going
mm,
on. And I just think that really kind of belittles women as well. So it's very difficult balance.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at so many countries where things you think have got better and they'll stay better and then they can go backwards. So we've got so many examples of that. So you can never assume that even the most basic right to speak, to be educated, to
Yeah. I think it was.
reproductive rights and
I think it was Tony Benn that said we have to keep fighting the same battles
Yeah.
over and over and over again because they're so easily taken from us.
Mm.
The rights that we fight for. I mean, look at America with the abortion rights.
Yeah.
It's absolutely. Who would have thought 10 years ago that we would have been
Yeah.
looking at that situation again now? This is something we fought it for in the 60s, and here we are fighting the same battles over and over and over again. And it's really, it's exhausting.
It is exhausting.
there's also something about social media that is so intrinsically problematic for women.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
firstly, the visual focus, so there's always been this obsession with what women look like, and that's on steroids now.
Yeah.
And then secondly, it's created a world of anger and hate and violence and abuse. So it's magnified that. And yes, social media is a phenomenal tool were it not used in a man-made world and in a man, in a dominant paradigm that exacerbates all of these inequalities. So we use it and it's great for us, but overall it's massively powerful for pornography, etc., etc. So
Yeah.
it's
And I think it's the rapidity of it, because I mean, looking back just 30 years in the 90s, we would never have imagined what's happened with it. It's
No.
evolved so swiftly. It's evolved faster than our brains can to understand it. And people just read something and believe it. You know, a lie comes out and it's round the planet in 2 seconds, and it's believed. It's really quite frightening.
And yet, you get things. I mean, I was amazed at, I can't remember whether I said it to Kate. I said it at some meeting we're at. I was listening to, I don't know whether it was Desert Island Disc or something, I don't know. But Minnie Driver was on. And I found it unbelievable that even in the 70s, a woman couldn't get her own mortgage and her mother couldn't get a mortgage. And so you think, well, at least that can happen now. So there are things like that you think, yes, you can see that. But that would be ludicrous now that a woman could get a mortgage. But then underneath all this, you get all this vitriol and very confrontational way of behaving that seems to be growing. And it seems to be that perhaps some, and I am saying some men, some people feel powerless when they see women gaining a bit more power. And they just can't kind of understand that actually women should have equal power.
Yeah, I think the fact that we are now talking quite a lot about what's in it for men and boys in this context in which we are talking so much more about women who are more visible in a number of roles that they were not visible in for the previous generation. So women are occupying space, and men and boys are kind of looking at this and thinking their space has shrunk, and there isn't this conversation about the fact that that means a changed perspective and that there are gains to be held by that different role. But the reality is, if society doesn't value those roles, doesn't economically value caring or nurturing or all of these things that we are saying, but there's all of this that you could be doing, for them, yes, but those are not monetarily valued, nor is society in so many ways valuing them, because if they would, we wouldn't have the NHS with the crisis that it's in and the teaching professions in the crisis that they are. And then meanwhile, you've got, guess what, these amazing, powerful men at the top of the world, saying, but, here's this alternative way that you could look at things, and here's some memes that will make you laugh. And so all of that is pulling them in, and the counter that we have is really weak.
Georgie's asked a question. Georgie works same charity as me, and we're doing like feminist groups and empowerment groups in schools. And one thing we've learned of late is that the girls really know what they want from the future, but they never get asked in most things. What advice would you give to young girls who do want to make a difference?
I think you're right that they often have thoughts at the back, and it's courage and confidence to speak, partly, isn't it? I mean, I would say start with small things, and that everything that you do build on and do it with others and do it with fun. Don't see this as some kind of cause that you don't
Yeah.
have your heart in, because and having your heart in it, but also making it something joyful. The suffragettes had so much fun with the things that they were doing, and I think it's important because you need perseverance and you need resistance, and that will drain you no end if you don't bring an element of fun in all of it. And then one of the things one of the stories I often quote is Adela, the third of the Pankhurst sisters, went to Australia, as I mentioned, and her granddaughter told me that one of her memories of Adela was walking with her, and Susan was told by her grandmother to pick up a bit of litter, and Susan said, well, what's the point? You know, me picking up a bit of litter isn't going to make that big of a difference. And Adela said, it will make a difference to how you look at the problem. So I think that's really powerful for anybody wanting to make a difference. You might not change the world, but it's your relationship to that issue, and that already is so massive.
Yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant. That is brilliant, Helen. That is,
Love it too.
that I really got that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate that. And yeah, I'll keep you posted on ours, because I have quite a bit to do with some of your colleagues in Manchester as well. And then I've been working really closely with the Art Museum. You know, they've done the hidden uncertain futures, haven't they? And that's been really fascinating as well.
Great. And I look forward to coming to see the statue in due course.
Yes, it will happen. Yes, definitely. Sorry, Diane, did you just want to end on something else?
No, it's fine. No, I just turned my mic on so I could say thank you at the end of it.
Oh.
That's all.
Oh, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Helen.
much.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.